Welcome to lecture number 20. This is topic 3.5, the American Revolution. The theme is America in the World. The learning objective is explain how various factors contributed to the American victory in the Revolution. There's only one key concept, but it is broken into two parts. The first part talks about what the colonists had to overcome. It states that there was considerable loyalist opposition as well as Great Britain having an overwhelming military and financial advantage. Loyalists who were colonists and supported remaining as part of the British Empire were between 1/4 and 1/3 of the colonial population. By John Adams' own estimation, the colonists were divided into equal thirds of loyalists, patriots, and neutral colonists that would support whichever side won. The loyalists supported the king and wanted to maintain that relationship. They continued to hold that a monarchy was the best form of government, and some of them took up arms against the patriots. Because they were scared for what would happen after the Revolution, over 80,000 of those loyalists emigrated after the war, so they went all different parts of the British Empire. A lot of them were in New York and New England, and they ended up in British Canada and settled in Nova Scotia and Halifax. Other loyalists will go to British Florida, and when it becomes Spanish Florida, they'll have to relocate once again. Some will go to Jamaica, other parts of the Caribbean, Australia, and even India. Britain's military was also formidable. They had just beat the French in North America in the French and Indian War. They already had troops in North America left over from the French and Indian War and forts that they could use to coordinate their control of the colonies. They also were allied with most of the Iroquois tribes. The Mohawks were some of the most important British allies, and in the top right are portraits of the same person. That's Joseph Brant, that he was the leader of the Mohawk tribe, and was one of the 5 tribes of the Iroquois. The one on the left was done by a British painter in England, and the one on the right was done by the American painter Charles Willson Peale. Britain also had enough money to continue to pay for regular troops and for war supplies like weapons, munitions, and uniforms. The redcoats pictured on the bottom left on the screen were paid soldiers, and the British were able to pay other troops that they would hire. The Hessian mercenaries hired by Britain are best known for their defeat in the Battle of Trenton at the hands of George Washington, but their presence gave Britain a continued advantage in battle. Despite all of those advantages that the British had, the Patriots' cause succeeded because of the actions of colonial militias and the Continental Army, George Washington's military leadership, the colonies' ideological commitment and resilience, and assistance sent by European allies. The Patriots and the Continental Army had some advantages of their own. Colonial militias were involved in the fighting despite being undersupplied and underpaid. They knew the terrain well, and they were fighting in their home territory. The Continental Army that was led by George Washington at its largest had 20,000 soldiers, and one of the largest victories was in Saratoga in 1777. The painting depicting the surrender of the British surrender at Saratoga shows the British general giving his sword to the American general Horatio Gates. The victory inspired the French to ally with the Americans. The French weren't crazy about the colonists overthrowing a king because the French had a king of their own, but they really wanted to stick it to their old rival Britain after having been defeated by them in the French and Indian War. George Washington's leadership cannot be understated. He had some tough spells as seen in his defeat at the Battle of Long Island early on in the war, and the winter encampments at Valley Forge. At Valley Forge, cold weather and scarcity of food supplies were at least eased by the help from neighboring Indian groups that helped feed the Continental Army. Washington was also really good at delivering buzzer-beater victories when it counted the most. The most important of these was the Battle of Trenton. It was the end of 1776. Most of the people who had signed up to be part of the Continental Army had contracts that would expire at the end of the year. So on Christmas Eve, George Washington takes the Continental Army across the Delaware River into Trenton, New Jersey, and takes the Hessian mercenaries by surprise. It also serves as a way to restock supplies and munitions that inspired the soldiers to sign on for another year. Colonists had a greater ideological commitment to seeing the war through. Self-government was at stake for those colonists who were fighting. If they lost the war, patriots could have been executed as traitors, so they had more incentive to continue to fight. For some of these colonies, they had a tradition of self-government that went back almost 150 years. There was a lot at stake for the colonists if the war was to be lost. Women camp followers kept troops supplied wherever they went. They would do the laundry, they would do the cooking, and they would tend to camp while the troops would fight. Sometimes the women who followed camp were spouses of soldiers. There were also women who impersonated men to fight. Deborah Sampson is the most famous example of that. She was wounded in battle, and that's how she was found out to have been a woman. Other women who were aiding the battle lines were called Molly pitchers. They were women who would bring pitchers of water, and they would pour the water on top of the cannons after they had been fired, so that way the metal around the cannon would cool down and they could fire the next shot. So there was a greater amount of commitment for the cause that both men and women took up the call and did whatever they could in their capacity to fight for independence. Finally, we already talked about the European allies in the form of the French. Had it not been for the French, there would have not been an American victory. The French were key in the final Battle of Yorktown, in which Lord Cornwallis surrenders in 1781. French naval assistance comes into play. They distracted the British Navy that is docked outside of the town of Yorktown. They draw them into a naval battle, and then in the middle of the night, they take the position that the British Navy had on the shore of Yorktown. Cornwallis was on his way back to Yorktown to resupply, not knowing that their ships were no longer there. George Washington and the French allies come in on the heels of the British and surround the British. The French assistance that came from Admiral Rochambeau and Marquis de Lafayette brought troops, guns, supplies, and most importantly, the aid of the French Navy. Alright, for the recap, you need to make sure that you know for the writing portion of the exam some of the British advantages, including troops, weapons, and loyalists. Then the Patriot advantages, including the home field advantages, the commitment from colonists and the Continental Army, the French aid, and the leadership of George Washington. Finally, the war ends in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, 2 years after the last main battle in which the British had surrendered. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen. And if you are looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.